Tip number 8. If you hear that your story isn't working as well as it could or should, it could be because the structure and pacing of your story is off the mark. It just isn't as effective as it should be in the story. Now, when some people hear the word structure, especially from me it seems, they leap to all kinds of conclusions and it triggers all kinds of gut reactions. Some people, when they hear structure, they hear formula. It's not formula. Often when that type of response is forthcoming when structure is brought up, it illustrates a lack of understanding as to what structure really is in a story. Structure is not the strategy of your story. It is the underlying flow of the story in such a way that it maximizes, it optimizes the reader response. And this is something that has been evolved and proven over hundreds, if not thousands of years of storytelling. So we've landed on the structures that we use, the various iterations of it and forms of it, which are all just different takes, different versions of the same basic linear philosophy. Now, let me give you a real-life example to show you why structure is necessary. Let's say you wake up one morning and you grab better yet, I was going to say you grab the newspaper, but better yet, you turn on the television and there's a report there that someone has been hit by a car and killed. Now that's terrible. But let me ask you, how do you really feel when you hear that? And if you've got any ounce of humanity, you probably pause a moment and think that's just horrible. You feel for the family. And by the time the next news report is on, you're listening to that instead. And that's the extent of your emotional response to something. Now, let's take that same scenario and frame it differently. Let's say you get up in the morning and you turn on the TV and there's a report that someone's been hit and killed in a car accident, and you realize that you know that person. You went to school with that person. You're still friends with that person. You have equity in your relationship with that person. How does that same news hit you now? Really hard. Well, this is why we have structure, because structure tells us, shows us a place to inject the launch of the dramatic arc, the sky is falling moment in your story. If you do that too soon, you haven't allowed time for the reader to become emotionally invested in the character, to get to know the character, to relate to the character, and to establish the stakes of the story. What becomes at stake when you thrust your hero down a path based on some need, which is often the need to respond to something bad or pursue something opportune. But if you don't have an emotional investment in that, it isn't as effective. Conversely, if you wait too long to do that, the story drags. All of us have started reading a book with great hope, read the reviews, recommended to us, whatever, and you sense that nothing's happening quickly enough. And dozens of pages later, you still feel like not enough is happening. And you may even put the book down at that point. That's because of a structure that's off as well. So structure isn't a set of rules at all. It isn't a formula at all. It's a principle that allows your innate story sense. It guides your innate story sense toward making decisions that are more effective. Now, let me give you one more real-life example where structure is concerned to kind of illustrate what happens when a newer writer doesn't understand this, when a newer writer is operating solely from their evolution of their own story sense without ever having that been informed by somebody teaching them or their exposure to this principle, which is perhaps one of the strongest things in everything you need to learn about storytelling. I was up in Canada a couple of years ago at the Surrey International Writing Conference, and we have what are called blue pencils. And that's where the people that are teaching there and speaking there get to spend 20 minutes with writers who have signed up for this. And they present their story often in a written form, a one-pager, often in 10, 20 pages of writing, which I don't really like because you're either starting at the beginning of the story or jumping into the middle of the story without ever really being able to grasp what the whole story is about. So I prefer it in a pitch format, in a synopsis. Well, this fella had, one guy had a pretty great concept, a premise. It was a spy story set in Paris. And the hero was a retired U.S. Special Forces spy kind of fellow. And because of where he had been stationed earlier, he was called back into action and sent to Paris to go undercover because there was a network of operatives who were operating in the French intelligence community that were actually planning a terrorist act. And he needed to find out where the bomb was, when it was going to go off, and who was behind it, and of course stop it. And I said, wow, that sounds like a terrific story. Now, because I'm very deeply steeped in story structure, just hearing that, I could tell you at what point in the story something bad has to happen. And I can tell you right where the plot is going to twist, not because it's formula, but because that's what story structure does. It informs your story sense. So I asked the guy, I said, well, at what moment does his life change? In other words, when he's called out of retirement and he's sent to Paris and he finds something there that sends him down a dark and dangerous road. He thought a minute. He said, well, I'm not sure that ever really happens. And I said, well, it kind of has to happen, doesn't it, if your premise is about that, if it's about him going to Paris to find and stop a terrorist act. So you have to have the terrorist act in there someplace. He goes, yeah, I suppose. I said, well, tell me how you launched the story. And he started telling me all of this stuff about his character. And he finally got to the point where the character heard from an ex-superior officer and was told that he was being called back into service and sent to Paris. And I said, at what point in the story did that happen? He thought a moment and he said, about page 210. And I tried to keep it together and I said, how long is the whole book? He says, about 400 pages. So in effect, he had 210 pages of setup before the core dramatic arc even launched. And when in fact, that is in drastic violation of the principles of story structure. And there's just no way that story could work. Because I said, what are you writing about for 210 pages? He says, well, I'm writing about the character's life. I'm writing about his backstory and all the stuff that happened to him when he was in active service in Special Forces. And I said, oh, no, in other words, a biography of this hero. He says, yeah, that's what it is. I said, what's your story about? Is it about the biography of the hero? Or is it about a caper, a case, where he goes to Paris to stop a bombing? He said, well, it's about that. So I jotted down the basic arc of classic story structure for him, and he looked at it, and I could tell he just was in deep resistance, which so many authors are when they realize that there is such a thing as story structure, and that perhaps their story is not in alignment with it. The first gut response is to defend your story and your approach, and try to reject this notion. This is why this is tip number 8 on what just might screw up your story. It might tank your story. Your structure is off. So on the next slide, I'm going to present the very highest level graphic representation of story structure that can at least start your journey with this topic, with this skill set, this core competency of story structure, which it's one of the most important aspects of your writing journey. And look at your story, juxtapose this against what you have, and hopefully you see an opportunity to improve.